Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. This is a good one. Joining me today is Mats Ingulstad, a professor of history at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, whose research bridges the history of strategic materials, global supply chains, and the political economy of critical minerals. Mats has been focusing on the history of resource economics and how they affect geopolitics since long before geopolitics was given as the explanation for absolutely everything. He has also been working on the history of deep sea mining since well before it caught the public's attention. This makes Mats uniquely capable of placing deep sea mining in the historical context. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation. Mats gives me a tour of the origins of strategic and critical mineral policies and gives me a lot to think about in terms of the sort of questions that should be asked when designing resource policy and the risks that come along with being in control of important mineral commodities.
The supply chain, what will that look like? And both in a very stylist fashion relating to sort of where are the minerals pulled up and how are they transported to shore, how are they processed at sea, etc. How do you protect those facilities against foreign intervention? There are some security issues there that are maybe comparable to some challenges we have regarding infrastructure on the seabed from the continental shelf, the pipelines connecting Norway and Europe, and so there are a whole range of issues relating to supply security that I haven't heard anybody talk about this as a problem. All the focus is on Norway as a stable, secure supplier of minerals Europe needs, sure. But what are the risks? How do we then deal with foreign, if these resources are so critical to NATO's, if there's a NATO in the future, or European Defense Organization or whatever, that they invite foreign threats? How do we protect them? And what kind of cascading effects will be created by a challenge or an intervention from a foreign power trying to disrupt these supplies?
We spend a lot of time discussing the Norwegian situation, not only what is Norway doing right and wrong with its approach to its deep sea minerals, but why has Norway been so successful in the past with governing its resource industries. I really recommend this episode to anyone who is thinking about how deep sea mining is going to affect the economies, societies, and strategic defense of whatever nations are currently throwing their hats into the ring of marine minerals. It was a long conversation. We split it into two parts. This episode gets into critical minerals and resource strategies, while part two dives more specifically into the history and politics of the deep sea mining industry. Without further ado, I bring you Mats Ingulstad. Yeah, now we're talking. You look great.
Liar.
Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time. So, Mats Ingulstad, professor at NTNU. Can you start by giving me your personal history, a little bit about where you grew up and how you got to be a professor, and then how you came to focus on deep sea mining?
Yeah, sure. So I started doing history because I didn't know what else to do after a stint in the armed forces, and then I just stayed. I went to Florence to do my PhD at the European University Institute on U.S. foreign economic policy. I was interested in how particularly strategic materials figured at the intersection of defense, economic, and foreign policy objectives, and how they were negotiated within the US and then also with other countries when it came to essentially setting up global value chains for these kind of resources.
So strategic materials, is that somehow different than critical raw materials?
Well, there are different definitions at different points in time, but in the American terminology at the time, they thought of strategic materials as materials that had that were important for military end use and critical, and also where the supply from external sources was a problem in wartime, and critical materials were important resources that you could secure the supply of in wartime, and then you also had essential minerals as a category that warranted special attention to make sure that there was not a deficit in wartime.
Yeah, so this was a question I was thinking of asking you on my bike ride up here. Seems like there's been a whole bunch of attention around critical minerals coming in the last few years. I don't know if if the focus has really amplified since COVID, but I feel like a lot of people kind of think globalization is being threatened, so security of material supply is now an issue, and this is like a new issue that's never been dealt with before. Yeah, so I don't know. The question there is this a new issue that's never been dealt with before?
Definitely not. So you could argue that strategic or critical minerals policy is as old as warfare. How do you get enough copper and tin? Essentially, tin as a very hard to find mineral in the Bronze Age, even. But particularly, you have the aftermath of the First World War, when really this issue comes to the fore during the war, when you have industrial mobilization, global mobilization, and really for the first time, this is decisive. You have new technologies employed on battlefields requiring oil, but also light metals for military aviation. So there's some qualitative and quantitative changes to warfare that takes place during the First World War that focuses most military minds, but also political minds, on this issue in the First World War and the interwar period, and particularly during the Second World War and afterwards. So really, when we first get these lists compiled of strategic minerals or critical critical resources, and they experiment for a time with different conceptions. Do you define resource depending on whether it's needed by the army and or the navy, so the military end user, or do you define it according to vulnerabilities to external supply or a projected shortfall? Or there's some thinking going on about what is the best way to deal with this risk of supply security in wartime, when you are mobilizing all of society and putting all of its resources really into winning an industrial war. So that also creates a problem that everything potentially can be strategic. So you have, if you look at the list of strategic minerals or strategic resources during the Second World War, you can see it's just ballooning as more and more advanced technology is being deployed in the field, but also a larger and larger share of society is contributing to the war efforts in some way. So you have things like, well, that you would expect are critical, like aluminum, for instance, molybdenum, chromium, but also things like coconut shells and pepper. Eventually.
Why coconut shells?
Well, you could, if I remember correctly, the reason was that you could char the coconut shells and use them in filters for gas masks. So there are all kinds of experiments with different kinds of resources in wartime, because the material demands of industrial warfare are so great. So you even have attempts to find substitutes that would involve sort of a reindeer fur in life vest, for instance, or balsa wood. And that means that you are also taking your value chains and extending them into new regions of the world that have not really been a part of this industrial economy, or at least not a military industrialized economy previously.
So at what age did you go to Florence to do your PhD?
I was 25.
And you decided to focus on the history of strategic raw materials.
Yes.
And why?
Well, during my master's, I'd worked on the Norwegian aluminium industry and looking into the financing of Norwegian aluminium smelter, Sundal, which is still an important industrial venture today, which was financed through the Marshall Plan. And what I saw was that the financing was made dependent on Norway transferring aluminium to the American strategic stockpile as a repayment for the financing. of that smelter. That made me wonder, how unique is this tying an aid program with repayment conditions linking industrial development in Norway to American military mobilization for winning an industrial war against the Soviet Union? Because at that time, there was still not an assumption that a Third World War would be a short nuclear holocaust. They still thought in terms of another protracted industrial war. So you would need a lot of metal to build all the planes, the strategic bombers. You would need all kinds of other resources like rubber for tires, etc. And so I wondered, how did the US go about using its newfound position after the Second World War as the dominant industrial superpower, and how did it seek to ensure its supplies from allies and from distant lands of resources that it lacked within its own boundaries? So I wanted to figure out how this played out also in other countries, essentially on a global scale.
So I've always thought of the Marshall Plan as the US. I guess I've always thought of the financial aspects of the Marshall Plan, where the US basically became the dominant. I mean, maybe this is a little bit before Bretton Woods, but I felt like the Marshall Plan was the beginning of when the US kind of asserted just financial dominance over the post-war Europe. But you're saying that there was strings attached to strategic raw materials in that, so that it was also the US securing future military security.
Yeah. So it's a really multifaceted program. So it's too simplistic to think of it as this big American giveaway. It was also about shoring up the system that was conceived at Bretton Woods. So having what became essentially an open liberal world order where you trade in resources rather than sort of keeping them within your own national boundaries. So it was about shoring up American allies against the risk of political radicalism developing in case of a political collapse that looked feasible in the cold winter of 1947, at least in some instances. And it was also an attempt to essentially create a win-win situation where the US would have new industries built up in Europe and in European colonies that could supply the US with the goods it needed, in addition to securing liberal market-based democracies also as customers for American export industries in the longer term. It was really this attempt to meet a lot of objectives at the same time, and it was thoroughly debated in the US Congress. Several committees looked at, can the US do this? Should we do this? How can we go along using this to essentially ensure that we don't expend our resources needlessly in Europe without getting any return on our investment?
Okay, so then let's go back to your biography. So from doing your PhD on this topic, how did you get to be a professor? And then how did you come to be involved in the deep sea mining question?
Well, there's the personal side of the story. I have family ties here, so coming back to Trondheim and Norway made sense, but also there was a really interesting research environment operating here, and that was also very attractive with the people I knew from my time as a master student and looked forward to working together with. And at first I did some other projects. I worked on German occupation, and I worked on Norwegian research and development policy. I tried essentially to broaden out also my research profile, because you cannot be a one-trick pony in academia, essentially. And so I did a lot of different projects, and also move away a little bit from resources and started thinking about sort of more of an intellectual and cultural history approach to the ocean with some other colleagues in literature studies and law. I was also trying to experiment with different approaches as a historian. I'd done sort of this hardcore political economy, diplomatic history study of strategic resources, and now I wanted to understand more mindsets and culture and how that shapes the human relationship with a part of the natural environment. And also it was almost like a joke that I got into deep sea mining because we were playing around with project ideas. And I remembered reading a Donald Duck story from the early 1990s. Where Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck, they go looking for nodules, diving for them, and there's a sense of urgency because the law of the sea convention will enter into force. So there's a race to grab as much as they can before there's a new set of regulations. At some point I should go back and try to find that story, but it just stuck in my mind for some reason. So I thought, well, here's this. And this was 2015 or thereabouts. And there wasn't a lot of political discussion in Norway, or particularly not in the humanities, a lot of attention devoted to deep sea mining at the time. So it seemed like an interesting sort of side project to play around with and experiment with new ways of researching an issue. And I did not at that time think this would still be something I would be working on almost a decade later.
Well, yeah, you should absolutely. You said that Donald Duck was from the 1990s.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a little window into what people were expecting from the ISA when it started, that this would kick off the scramble for the resources. That was over 30 years ago.
Yeah, so it might be slightly apocryphal, and as historians, we're also wary of people telling their sort of lived experience, and it's possible I'm projecting some of this backwards onto the story, but at least that was what I knew essentially about deep sea mining in 2015. Okay, can we use this essentially as a window into how people think about the ocean as a space and the different ways in which we use the ocean as a medium for transportation, as a place to go and solve essentially problems on land by looking into the resources of the sea, and also to really understand this shift in the ocean itself, or how it's perceived, going from this over powerful or godlike structure and then becoming this very fragile thing at risk of influence and human activities. And I just wanted to find a way to get to grips with that story, and this looked like an interesting and fun and slightly zany case.
Well, this is great. So this is actually what I had invited you on to talk about. Only later kind of learned that you have expertise in these incredibly relevant historical cases of critical raw material policy. But yeah, so what I'm hoping that we'll talk about here is kind of the question of trust in society and how the social attitude toward deep sea mining manifests in acceptance of regulation and pushback and a lot of the conversation around the deep sea mining question. So in every podcast I've done so far, the question of trust really comes up as an issue. And it was pointed out to me during the first round of interviews that I did on deep sea mining that Norway is traditionally a very high trust society. It really stands out, especially coming from Canada, where we are in some ways a very similar country in terms of reliant on natural resource exploitation. Both of our countries are big oil producers, but I learned a little bit about how the difference in the regulatory aspect of Norway and Canada has created huge differences in outcomes for the countries. Norway has used its oil revenues to create this very robust social safety net, which I think Canada is just very envious of. Everybody looks back 30 years and says, why didn't we do this the same way that Norway did it? And so, yeah, I'm interested in hearing why Norway has developed to be different than Canada in terms of the kind of societal approach to, I guess maybe it's the political approach to natural resource governance and then the societal support for the political approach. So that is a kind of a long-winded lead into a couple of questions about, I'm not sure the best way to get into this. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the history of Norway as a natural resource state. Like, has Norway been dependent on exploiting its natural resources just since oil was discovered, or does it go back farther than that?
It goes a long way back. So I think you could say that there are some structural features to Norway, which ensures that we have always had this rather open economy. So slightly facetious, you could say that sort of the Viking Age was exporting violence and importing gold and slaves, and turning rather quickly into an export of dried fish, which was really, really huge industry. So there's this very long historical tradition on relying on exports of natural resources, and later also timber and also aluminum industry, which we also touched briefly upon, are sort of Norwegian examples of having massive interest in the exploitation of natural resources. So we have a historical experience and also a historical long-running debate about what is the best way to manage export-oriented natural resource-based industries. And particularly salient, I think, is the experience of hydropower with the Norwegian concession laws. And at the time, there was also a discussion, what is the right place for foreign owners, and the concession law regime ended up with essentially a political decision that you will have state control over these really important industries, and big decisions like this involving those kind of industries must also be subject to political negotiation. And that speaks also to the nature of Norwegian society and its long-term development. Again, some structural features. We haven't really had a big nobility in Norway, in part because it's hard to be a nobleman and running a large estate on the western coast of Norway. Essentially, we have been under.
Sorry, why is that? Why is it hard to be a nobleman? Because the mountains divide things into small estates, or because the land just doesn't produce that much surplus?
Both. Have a population that subsists on a combination of fisheries and growing some crops and also utilizing the woodland resources. And so it's really not suited for this large estates that you have in Denmark, for instance, or in parts of Sweden. So Norway never had good soil for a large landed nobility, and this ensures that as we enter into the 19th century and onwards, you have relatively weak national elites vis-a-vis the rest of society. So there's not this huge amount of stratification, and that also, I think, opens up a political space for the state. And this discussion about who can own and control natural resources, you don't have these huge vested industries to the same extent as in some other countries that dominate the political process and say, well, of course, these have to be privately owned and managed. And there are a few different names in the historical debate of this. Some call it democratic capitalism, because it merges this idea of democratic society that still relies on the market to provide solutions and growth, but with power clearly vested in democratic political institutions.
And so you mentioned earlier that Norway also, especially I guess during the development of the hydroelectric resources, had this issue of how to manage foreign investment.
Yeah.
And so is this also because they didn't have like a large upper class? There wasn't the capital to build out these big capital intensive projects. So at the same time, you've got this kind of very democratic structure with a lot of whatever commoners. But when it comes time to build, you need foreign capital, foreign investment to do this.
So Norway has, until fairly recently, been rather poor in capital. And so building up new industrial ventures like Norsk Hydro, for instance, requires some foreign expertise and foreign capital. And so that has been understood. But the discussion has revolved around what is the proper place and or the proper amount of foreign ownership. that you can allow in key industries. And there has also been fear at times. How can the state regulate these industries in a way that doesn't sort of open up for corruption, for instance? And this was also a fear hanging over the discussion over the hydropower regime. What if you have then state bureaucrats who are privately investing in hydropower, and if they act if they're in cahoots with foreign owners or some of the few rich families in Norwegian elites, then you get essentially a democratic problem. And so that was also a part of the discussion in that context already.
Wow. Okay, so I guess before we lose people who came to this podcast for specifically deep sea mining related topics, let me just jump all the way to the current day. And so how do you perceive the political discussion in Norway around the opening process for deep sea mining? Mm-hmm. Is there a lack of trust, and why has it become so contentious?
Well, I would say there's a lack of trust in the sense that nobody really knows what to expect from this kind of industry. There's no, so to speak, comparable industry that we can sort of draw on the experiences from. We don't know what is the kind of knowledge we need in terms of biological conditions, or also in terms of the geology that is really required, and how can we also, people from those disciplines, trust each other that have gathered sufficient information and turn that into reliable science, and particularly also how to move from the science to the politics. And right now it's really unclear, I think, to a lot of people how that process will look like. So how is this actually being decided? Because it looks from the outside like this is a really sort of rushed decision. You have the decision to open up, and essentially and there are some finer points here that a lot of people listening into this podcast will probably sort of start typing in the comment section. Well, it's not conflated anymore, but the license to explore and to exploit, and really muddling the communication about what is actually entailed if you get this license. So the opening for exploration and exploitation, which sort of creates a lot of uncertainty about what is going to be the political process for assessing this. How can we know that the politicians are sufficiently well informed about the risks and also the potential gains, and also the alternatives to make a good decision? So I think that is driving still a lot of the conversation around deep sea mining in Norway. A lack of trust in the transparency also around the political decision-making process.
I mean, we trust politicians to make these sorts of decisions all the time. And yeah, it's often pointed out to me that Norway generally has very high trust in government. If this was in even North America, but certainly in lots of other kind of places that are resource dependent, you would expect that, there's a lot of kind of just pushback that the government is saying that they're putting in a responsible regulatory regime, and then it's not going to be so responsible. But my perception was that in Norway, generally, the government has done a good job and people accept that. So is my perception right in that? Or has this also, like anytime Norway opens up a new resource exploitation area, is this kind of pushback just kind of par for the course?
In general, you're right. It's a very high trust society, and that also has a long historical explanation for how that came to be. And also the contrast with Canada is also salient, because this is a unitary state, a clearly centralized authority, and the trust in the state has also been tied up with the massive expansion of the welfare state after the Second World War, driven by the state. And so people have experience with the state as really an improver of people's everyday conditions and their long-term prospects. This has been keenly felt in Norwegian society. Also, when it comes to the management of the oil wealth, there are very few of these oil bureaucrats who were operating almost within a black box, who are now multi-billionaires or in the family of the prime ministers, which could be a sort of really drive erosion of trust. So there's no perception that the oil wealth has been mismanaged or directed into private pockets. So we do have that experience that this could actually work out really well. So I think it also is a matter of changing, or the high expectations also are a part of this discussion, because we hold our politicians and bureaucrats to very high standards in Norway, and we expect them to be accountable and transparent, and also involving us in the decision-making process. So I think that could also be solved if this opening process drags on for another decade or so, or maybe if we continue talking for 5 years about the pros and cons and the risks and the minimum standards for data and data sharing, etc. You could get to this place where there's a sufficient level of trust that the politicians make a good and well-founded decision.
Yeah, okay, so you're saying that it's not necessarily that there's a specific lack of trust in this situation for the government. You're kind of pointing to the way that this has been handled, the communication, the transparency. People aren't seeing in this case what's happening behind the closed doors, and people are used to seeing that when it comes to decision-making in Norway. And so it's something specific about the way that this process is handled that you think is creating such a pushback domestically.
Yeah, I think so. And also there's perhaps a mismatch between sort of the sense of urgency, which is communicated by the politicians. This is crucial. We have to do this yesterday because of the green shift and also for supply security considerations.
Mm-hmm.
And the long lead times required to actually turn this into an operational industry. So it's 10 years in the future, 15 years in the future, but it's being discussed like, yeah, we should go down there and start drilling now. So
is that, sorry, do you think that that's just misunderstanding from the perspectives of some of the politicians? Because like you say, you could discuss this like we're making decisions now that are setting us up for something that's going to happen 15 years from now.
Yeah.
So there's really no downside to talking that way. I mean, I've heard some kind of more strategic reasons for that, but yeah, do you think that this is a just kind of misunderstanding from the...
I would say it hasn't been well handled, particularly because of this sense of urgency, and there wasn't a lot of attention. And if we go back this decade or so to when I first started thinking about deep sea mining, it was not like something taking place in Norway. That was just some people at NTNU had a deep sea mining pilot, and there were resources put into researching this, but it wasn't really a part of the public consciousness. And suddenly, within the span of a very few short years, Norway is standing at the cusp of opening a whole new type of industry as the first in the world, with unforeseen consequences, and with really, in a way that has really mobilized a lot of resistance in parts of the research community, pointing to the lack of information. That has really helped drive this antagonistic response against Norway as a first mover in this. So again, if we look to the experience of the oil industry, we were at the verge of making similar mistakes, because there were some ideas that this will not really take off as an industrial venture, so we can sort of allow foreign companies to come in and also expend their money on research and development. And then when it was clear that there's a lot of money to be made here, the government stepped in. And we also had a broad political debate about what is the purpose really of opening up this oil industry in the North Sea. And it was clear, and there were some political objectives. It's going to facilitate Norwegian industrial development. It's going to facilitate other political objectives like broadening out the industrial base of Norway. It's going to contribute to how the population is distributed. Then there was a very public, but also within parties, but also in publicly and discussion about what are the gains, but also what are the risks and how should we actually handle this oil wealth. And we haven't really gotten to that stage yet in our current discussion about deep sea mining. So it's limited discussion as of yet about how should we let companies in, and should they be allowed to drill, and should we just give them a concession essentially to operate in a block system similar to the oil industry? Where should they operate? Here the management of the openings process looks like they say, we open everything unless you can tell us that we shouldn't open here, here, and here, knowing that the data is missing. So it's hard to build trust if that is the approach. When it came to the oil industry, it was sensible, and there was also an awareness in Norway that we need foreign capital, but also foreign expertise to do this. And remember, the Norwegian oil industry was also created in the midst of the EU referendum, so there was also a strong emphasis on national control, but still there was the recognition that we need the foreign companies to come here and operate as a part of this industry, to learn from them, but also to regulate them very, very strictly.
I mean, it sounds like just like a very complex and nuanced public debate was happening. I mean, I'm a little bit surprised or impressed that when Norway was kind of developing its oil infrastructure, that there were all of these topics kind of discussed the way you present them, kind of like discussed publicly. And I really want to get into the details of that, because I think that, especially coming from a Canadian perspective, the difference there is fascinating. But let's just linger on the deep sea mining question 1 minute longer. So has there been any decisions made about the sharing of resource rents in the deep sea mining case, or is that decision essentially just kind of pushed into the future?
Yeah, as far as I know, that's been postponed. The white paper just pushed this resource rent issue to the side and said, well, we'll figure that out later.
Sorry, which white paper?
The question of resource rents or the rent tax. Does that sound right to you? Resource rent?
I would say resource rent tax.
Yeah, resource rent tax.
But I don't think, I think it's a very central concept in Norway in a way that, I had never kind of thought about resource rents. But my understanding of the grunnrenteskatt kind of comes out of the hydroelectric history.
And then you also have the salmon farming industry, which is the most current discussion that we had about resource rent tax. And the experience there was that if the politicians wait for too long to formulate a clear principle on the resource rent tax, you allow the companies to mobilize against the political decisions. And because by then the salmon farming companies were massive, deep pockets, and they can mobilize as much legal firepower as you can find to fight against government. And they could sort of send the cleaning ladies from the small island communities and put them in front of parliament and make it look like a grassroots movement against the resource rent tax. And this also, I think, belies a little bit of contrary to the historical experience in the oil industry, where the Norwegian sales pitch to the foreign corporations was that here there will be strict regulations and there will be a very high tax level, but we also offer political stability. Already in the 1980s and 1960s, the Norwegian government had been trying to attract foreign investors to Norway and essentially making the pitch that there's no risk here of nationalization. There's no a new economic world order being put in place in Norway. So you don't have to worry about nationalization or expropriation of your assets like you have to worry about in African countries or Latin America, for instance. And this is what we offer. So it's going to be costly, yes. And we're going to favor the Norwegian state-owned oil company and to a great extent, but still it will be stable enough that you will make a lot of profit. The contrast to the way the current regulatory regime is being discussed, there is so much uncertainty around how will you tax it, and what will the actual legal framework be for the licenses to operate, and essentially the whole political feasibility of this industry is still up in the air. If I had been an investor, I would be very skeptical of sort of putting my money into Norwegian deep sea mining at the moment until this political discussion has gone on for a bit longer, or maybe a lot longer, and sort of there's a broader political consensus about what shall be the regulatory framework for this industry.
Interesting. Yeah, okay, so this idea of dealing with resource rent tax is very central to kind of why I wanted to talk to you today from the historical perspective, because so I had seen a figure that put different kind of oil nations side by side on the proportion of their resource rents that get essentially put towards, get captured by the government or put in towards societal coffers, essentially. And I probably get these numbers slightly wrong, but Canada was something like between 5 and 10%, and Norway was between 60 and 80% towards the collective benefit from the rents off of this is specific to the oil extraction. And so I've always wondered, like, why did Canada do such a poor job of this, and why did Norway do such a great job of this? And you're telling some of the details here about the conversation that was happening and some of the aspects that Norway negotiated so well at this time. So I guess two things. First of all, do you have like an overview of what were the great decisions that Norway made at the time, things that you haven't already covered? And then why was Norway in a position to kind of demand such a pro-social outcome, when I think that must have been quite unique at that time in the world? So
Norway wasn't alone. Far from it, actually. Remember that the Norwegian oil adventure, as such as starts in the 1970s, when there's this whole international negotiation going on about what is going to be the proper relationship between the producing countries and the consuming countries that had previously dominated also in the oil industry, particularly American oil companies, multinationals, also in other industries. And with the new international economic order, UNCTAD, and this whole movement for essentially commodity cartelization that will enable producers to stick together to demand a larger share of the resource rents to go to their own societal development, was something that Norway could latch onto. And then in addition, we had this EU referendum, or the EEC referendum, that also strengthened the case for national control. So I think the decisions that were made around the initial part of the Norwegian oil industry and its development, you wouldn't have had that in the early 1960s and not in the 1980s, when the blue wave essentially, or the turn to the market was in full effect in many Western societies. So in that sense, Norway was one of many countries thinking along these lines, but we had some advantages that other of these producer countries did not have, because Norway had a strong state tradition of sort of competent state-run economic management, too strong in many people's views, and also the OECD was unsure, can we think of Norway as a command economy or a market economy? But at least strong state control was politically feasible, and also the other countries that tried to introduce this, they could not rely on this sort of competent bureaucracies. I mean, how many trained oil engineers did Iraq have, for instance, in the 1960s? And so Norway was in a much better position to capitalize on that then.
You say there was this question of whether Norway was really a market economy or a command economy, and this is because Norway had some very powerful state-owned...
We had strong state regulations on capital, on the activities of banks, and essentially credit could be directed for political purposes to favor certain industries. And there was really this strong optimism and belief in the capacity of the state to make good decisions about who are going to be the winners, so to speak, what is most favorable for Norway as a society. And there was a sort of self-confidence also on the part of the politicians that we can make better decisions on this than the market can, for instance.
And this comes out of the buildup of Norwegian industry after the Second World War?
Yeah, precisely. That buildup on Norwegian industry also relies on foreign capital, like the Marshall Plan and with the aluminium smelter, for instance. But there's this sense that Norwegian politicians can make these good decisions.
Sorry to interrupt so much, but so the development of Norwegian industry at this time is the industry is essentially various uses for the electricity coming out of the hydropower that is being developed. So aluminum and other chemical industries, I guess fertilizer. I'm not sure if that was still a big industry here. So there's this kind of combination of a public resource, the water power, and there was this discussion about who owns the rights to the benefits from the water power, and those were directly tied into these industries. The industries were using this public resource, which maybe is different from other situations where you're just making an industry kind of from scratch and the capitalist could kind of claim, no, I built this. Whereas in Norway, the industry is much more tied directly to, this public good. Do you feel like that's a factor here, or am I just stretching for an explanation?
No, that's a part of the explanation. And you have the fact that the oil is out in the ocean, so it's very clear that there's no no pre-existing rights to that resource. So as a contrast to Canada, where their provinces have strong land rights and a robust view on who should regulate those kind of resources, there was this idolization of industry also within the Labour government. This was about sort of creating capital-intensive industries that could also support model societies for workers, essentially using the hydropower in these small local communities and make them into model societies. What should a robust social democracy look like? How can it provide benefits for the working class? And essentially also reduce tension within society, because this is a part of the Nordic model or the social democratic approach to the economy as a mixed economy, where you negotiate on the relative positions and influence of private ownership and state ownership and regulation. And you accept that the balance can shift over time, and you agree that this is legitimate. So that is a part of the political philosophy of social democracy, which is also a very big part of this post-war buildup of Norwegian industries. And that also enables these agreements or the consensus to endure also into the 1990s and 2000s, when the position of the state in the oil industry is being reconfigured on several occasions, where the position of the Statoil as the big state oil company, and there is a concern it might monopolize a lot of the rest of the economy and essentially steer resources and potentially also starting influencing politics by virtue of its command of this great wealth, and essentially become a threat to the Norwegian democracy and the ability of Norwegian politicians to regulate. All of these occasions, there has been a sort of political consensus supporting the direction. It might have been messy and noisy at the time, but in the end, there has been a sort of broader agreement that, okay, this is how we rebalance and reconfigure the place of this industry within the political economy of Norway. So that has been a part of this post-war experience, also going into the present day. There are some other aspects too, but now I forget your initial question.
Well, I guess I'm thinking now, because a lot of the listenership to this podcast is international, so they might not be super familiar with kind of what are the markers of success of the Norwegian oil experience. So maybe you just can explain briefly the pension fund and the Statoil, now Equinor.
Yeah. So a part of this, it actually ties on to my previous rant here. The decision to take control of the revenue stream from the North Sea and place it under political as opposed to the company's control. Around 1984, there was a political debate where Statoil was presented even as a cuckoo within Norwegian society. It could essentially outgrow democratic control. Leading those revenue streams in under state control was important. We also had a set of demands that were placed on foreign companies to get access to the North Sea. In order to get concessions, you had to essentially promise also to contribute to the development of Norwegian competency in this area. So not exactly training your replacement, but financing and helping developing Norwegian research clusters that can develop new technologies that are appropriate for the North Sea and that will also contribute to a broader industrial development based on R&D within the oil sector. Not all of those ventures ended well, and there were some attempts to ask oil companies to help develop sort of fish oil refineries in remote coastal communities, etc., that were never likely to succeed and develop into viable industrial ventures. But there was the sense that this competency that the foreign companies have and we need in order to make good decisions on our own and also develop this resource on national control were made fairly early on. And then...
so just on that, because to me that stands out as one of the really smart things that Norway did that I haven't heard that other countries did, is kind of say, yes, you can come in and exploit our oil wealth, but you have to do it along with us.
Yeah.
And so not only do you get the economic benefits of that, but you get the strategic negotiating benefits of that in the next round when they want to say, well, we want whatever share of the resource rents. Then the Norwegian government can say, well, actually, we have the competence to do this ourselves, so you can play with us or you can go away, but we're no longer beholden to you, which I think I've heard anyway is certainly one of the problems in Canada, that a lot of our oil is being mined by American companies, and we tried having a national company on the Norwegian model, but we didn't stick with it, and so we're in a very weak negotiating position.
This is going back to the sort of already in the 1970s. There was also talk about sort of creating this kind of oil fund where the revenue should go. So there has been an ongoing discussion how to use the wealth in the best possible way, and related to that, what is the proper tempo of extraction, and because you want to ensure you have a balanced economic development, and if you suddenly have this vast corporation or a few big corporations that dominate the Norwegian economy, they will essentially drain the rest of the society's resources because everyone is going to be an oil engineer, and that is not politically desirable. And so the sense that we need political control to avoid that from happening is something that has been a persistent part of the Norwegian oil industry's development.
Well, the number of variables that you describe as being considered in this decision-making process is striking to me. Not only are you considering national control and the role of the free market, but even how is this industry going to swamp out the other industries? Is there such thing as kind of too much GDP growth too fast?
Yeah, and also what kind of foreign policy problems can arise from developing this oil industry, and because oil is also an intensely political economy, and so there was this awareness that this could be a problem. It can create new challenges for Norwegian politicians that they were not perhaps ready to deal with. And here there's a parallel today as well with deep sea mining. You see the reputational risk involved in deep sea mining and the hit Norwegian society or Norwegian politicians have taken, at least in the eyes of other countries, when it comes to being responsible managers of marine resources. It is hard to actually translate into money and put a price on that reputational damage. You also then some challenges relating to if we are going to be a supplier of critical minerals to the EU and to NATO, then we also have to look at what kind of problems will then arise in when it relates to control over Svalbard, the Norwegian Sea, what kind of risks for disruption of those industrial facilities that are placed on the seafloor. All these kind of dimensions haven't really been discussed publicly yet, but they will have to be dealt with at some stage.
Explain that a little bit more. So you're suggesting that one of the aspects that is not well enough considered here is the vulnerability of this potential industry to foreign interference. If Norway builds a functioning industry for exploiting these very geopolitically significant critical minerals, what are the effects of that going to be on Norway's ability to maintain control over this large portion of somewhat contested ocean?
Yeah. So Norwegian lawyers and the foreign ministry would say that this is not an issue because Norwegian sovereignty over Svalbard is clear, and sort of the law of the sea is clear, and this is the Norwegian area, and we can do with it as we please. But my concern is rather that you can have politically motivated challenges and attempts to test what we think is established law of the land and of the sea, and that will create challenges just dealing with that, and that's just one part of the problem, and the other is sort of the more practical issue of maintaining control and of a very rough patch of ocean. So if you have the facilities established, there's so much we don't yet know about the technology that will be used to harvest these resources and where they will be harvested. So the impact on the biota, but the supply chain, what will that look like? And both in a very stylist fashion relating to sort of where are the minerals pulled up and how are they transported to shore, how are they processed at sea, etc. How do you protect those facilities against foreign intervention? There are some security issues there and that are maybe comparable to some challenges we have regarding infrastructure on the seabed from the continental shelf, the pipelines connecting Norway and Europe, and so there are a whole range of issues relating to supply security that I haven't heard anybody talk about this as a problem. All the focus is on Norway as a stable, secure supplier of minerals Europe needs. Sure. But what are the risks? How do we then deal with foreign if these resources are so critical to NATO's, if there's a NATO in the future, or European Defense Organization or whatever, that they invite foreign threats? How do we protect them? And what kind of cascading effects will be created by a challenge or an intervention from a foreign power trying to disrupt these supplies?
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, because I've heard a lot of talk about the upsides of securing these supply chains or getting a handle on supply of these critical minerals. I have never heard anybody kind of mention that it comes along with a bunch of risks. It was very interesting to hear just the variety of details and nuance that need to be considered in the decisions that are being made right now about this.
And just this is trying to get into the heads of also European policymakers and industrialists based on my studies of American policymakers trying to establish value chains during the Cold War. They were very conscious that supply chains have different risk levels. They can be disrupted for geological, political, all kinds of reasons. And so they had a system where they discounted the supplies against expected risk from different sources. So some countries were more risky to invest in than others, and some were further away, more vulnerable shipping lanes, etc., etc. And those kinds of considerations I would expect would also come into play when, say, German factories have to figure out where can we most reliably source our mineral supplies. I'm not saying Norway and the deep sea is not preferable to some politically contentious areas in Africa or having value chains under Chinese control, but there are different ways to configure these supply chains that maybe can be seen as less risky than having robots on 4,000 meters depth in the Norwegian Sea.
So interesting. Okay, well, I've kind of lost my place in the narrative that I was aiming to get out of this conversation. In a lot of ways, I feel like we've covered a lot of what I was hoping to ask about. Yeah, just on the topic, I mean, you're pointing out all of these additional factors that I had never heard kind of discussed. Now, I'm not the most up to date on all of the discussions happening, both domestically and internationally, about deep sea mining. But what other factors can you kind of point out? What other details need to be considered in these discussions that you think are being, again, under discussed?
Well, so I'm also a historian, so I'm not sort of following from day to day the discussions within the EU or the International Seabed Authority on these issues either. And these are also moving targets, and historians prefer to have a look at the documents afterwards and figure out what was the end result of the process as well. But from some of the factors I think merit consideration when we're talking about whether to open or how and on what conditions, and for what potential gains, is to just be clear about the risks inherent in the technological development trajectories moving forward towards this green shift, potentially. Here, there you can look at the historical experience of industrialized societies. Most often, when we gain new sources of supply, they tend to come in addition to rather than replacing previous technologies. So we didn't stop mining for coal, even though we started relying on oil. And so making that break with the fossil fuel dependency, I guess it will require more than what I think the current political debate suggests that politicians are ready to do, because there are a lot of things you have to do to win your economy of oil rather, and mining the Norwegian Sea. It will not sort of stop coal mining in Poland. I think it's fairly clear. So that's one part of it. And the other is that whenever there have been supply security issues that have arisen in the past, you don't see societies collapsing because of a lack of critical minerals of a particular kind. Most often there are substitutes that can be found to address shortfalls and that were not thought of previously, or you get a shift in the technological development that creates a whole set of new problems, but also a whole set of new possibilities. Relying on the projections for future mineral demands being made now in the International Energy Agency has published is I think, problematic, because these are scenarios, and a lot of assumptions go into making those scenarios about minerals demand. And I'm definitely not saying that the future will not, and the green shift will not be minerals intensive. But what I'm saying, it might not be the minerals that we're currently thinking of, and it might, and the prices they will command might not be enough to defend the investments that are necessary to have deep sea mining turn into a going concern in rather harsh conditions at sea. So that's also, I guess, maybe an additional issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the second time that I met you, I presented some scenario projections related to deep sea mining, and that was a question that you asked me from the gallery, is kind of something about how do you know these projections are going to be the one, what's the difference between a forecast and a scenario? And I just kind of mumbled something at the time, but I really regret not asking you that question? Like, what do you think is an alternative to making these scenarios, or is it just that we have to be aware that they're going to be wrong?
So if I knew how to predict the development of commodity markets, I would not be a history professor, to put like that. I would rather be a very, very, very rich man. All I'm saying, or all I'm asking for, is a little bit of humility regarding how those projections are used in the political debate. So politicians always have to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. That's the nature of politics. They don't know what's a good in a decision or a bad decision, and sometimes it takes decades before you actually know whether establishing a Norwegian oil fund is a good idea or not. That was established at a time when oil prices were relatively low, and so it took a long time. Well, it took a few years, and then suddenly two towers collapsed, and there's a war in in the Middle East, and oil prices skyrocket, and suddenly you have this massive influx of money that could not have been predicted just a few years previously, because the expectation at the time was that Norwegian oil production is nearing its peak, it will go down, and so we have to manage the decline somehow, and instead the revenue keeps on increasing even though production goes down. This is an outcome that you cannot reasonably expect politicians to foresee. And it's just that kind of humility that I would ask for. And that also relates to the conditions on the seabed. I mean, it's not within my lifetime, but just barely beyond my lifetime. And there was this discovery that you have life that relies on synthesis, different life form that changes our idea of life on the planet. And it's not in the too distant past, and that this kind of awareness that the ocean operates in a different way than we previously thought. That kind of humility is not just on market and technology development, but also on our understanding of the ocean. I think if you asked oceanographers 1975, they would say, well, of course, nothing lives down there on the bottom of the sea, or very little. Whatever is there feeds off the detritus and marine snow, and that is all essentially stemming from photosynthesis on the surface. And then suddenly you have a very different understanding of the conditions in the ocean. So both on the scientific and the market and technology development, we have to realize and manage this uncertainty. And I think one way of perhaps addressing this issue of lack of trust is to be more transparent, that it's not a given that the lithium demand will be so and at so a price in 10 years in the future. We don't know that. And it's not a given that there's no damage to marine life, and the condition there might be very different than we expect. But this transparency should also then be backed up with an investment in research, which the government is now doing. And this is why I also have been critical of the Norwegian process, is because we have started out by saying, yeah, this should be an industrial venture and that can create vast wealth based on some scenarios and some ideas about future price developments, when we should have started out mapping these areas. And now the government is finally putting the money into this mapping. So that should have been done before and not after the opening process has been so far advanced in Parliament. Investing in this is a risk. Norway, due to its stewardship and management of the oil wealth, is in a position to invest and lose. The Norwegian state can afford losing that money, and rather than trying to get private industry to put its money into exploration and potentially exploitation by muddling the terms of the regulatory framework and sort of suggest that this might be incredibly beneficial if you just invest now and you find something, and then we can expect after political decision-making process is done, that you will be able to make a lot of money here. This is sort of starting from the wrong end. It's not been the way these concessionary processes necessarily has been run across the world throughout of history, but maybe we as a society, if we want to be the first in the world to establish this industry, we should see, can we develop a new approach that's even more sensible? We have been very fortunate in the way the Norwegian oil adventure has played out. Some good decisions, but also a lot of luck with the price developments going up, the price going up after we started developing the North Sea, thanks in part to OPEC and this demand for rebalancing of power between producers and consumers. And also with the developments after 2001, we have been very, very fortunate with that. And so that money that we've gained should then be, we should afford taking this risk to just look carefully, how well can we understand this area, these resources, but also the life and the conditions and how this actually operates as an ecosystem before trying to do something to it.
Yeah, this question of the role of public or private money in the research phase, everyone agrees that we're in the research phase, and a lot of the misunderstanding seems to be about whether or not the companies who invest money into doing the research now are going to, if the government is going to be able to kind of say no in the future. I think something that everybody needs to keep in mind is that, yeah, so like you've kind of said, the government is trying to encourage private money to do some of this research, to take some of this risk that the government so far hasn't really been willing to just pay for the research and take the risk itself. You're trying to encourage the private sector to do some of that. But the money, I mean, if it's a successful industry, the money comes from the revenues one way or another. I could be wrong about this, but I think one of the admirable things that Norway does as compared to Canada in its oil exploitation regime is that the Norwegian government pays companies to do exploration. And I think that the Canadian government expects companies to do the exploration on their own, but gives them higher revenues from the exploitation phase later on. And so it's, you know, in the end, it's kind of, again, it's the same where the companies are putting up that money because they expect it to come back from future revenues. It seems to me like, because the way the Norwegian government does it, where they say, we're going to, you know, we'll pay you something for your exploration costs, no matter whether you find something or not, you get somehow a more trustworthy, a more responsible exploration process. And at the end of the day, if it all goes well, the money comes from the same place.
What the government is doing now, and when it's issued a call through the Norwegian Research Council, inviting collaboration between research institutions and also other actors, I think is how this should have been handled. The contrast or the difference between the oil industry regime that has really, where the government is bearing now a part of the burden of, or the cost of exploration, and sort of encouraging the company to come in and accept high taxes because the risk is so low, then that also resembles or points to the Norwegian oil industry being so lucrative that companies accept high levels of taxation and really, really onerous conditions also in the past to promote technology development, but also accepting the risk that the Norwegian oil company Statoil could come in and say that, well, you have done the exploration, but this looks really, really lucrative. We want to increase our share of ownership, and there's nothing you can do about it. And the companies, the foreign companies accepted this because still there was enough money to be made under sufficiently stable conditions that it would defend the investment. The dilemma with the Norwegian sea and deep sea mining is that you have some projections, some scenarios that indicate that there's a lot of minerals that could be really lucrative. If everyone believes those assessments and say, of course, this is spectacularly lucrative, it will bring great benefits and industrial development, and we could have minerals processing on Svalbard or Jan Mayen or along the western coast or wherever, then if it's that lucrative, you should expect private companies to be able to bear the risk of exploration But which the flip side is that there's so much uncertainty about, if we accept that there's so much uncertainty about the actual resource endowments, before you classify them in geological terms as resources or reserves that can be exploited, then it's right and proper to say that, well, actually, this is for the state to bear the responsibility and also invite private companies in to the exploration and do the mapping in a collaboration with the scientific community, ensure that we have data that everyone can trust. There are so this is the dilemma, really, that I don't envy Norwegian decision makers either, because on one hand you have these really fanciful scenarios where there's great wealth, a lot of money to be made, and on the other hand you have the research community saying, well, there's a lot of uncertainty, we're not sure whether this will be lucrative. And how do you sort of strike the proper balance between private risk and public risk? And this is essentially a part of this ongoing historical discussion that we started out with about who is supposed to bear the risk and who's supposed to gain the benefits from this kind of investment. What is the proper role of the state as a regulator, as an owner, and what's the proper role of private corporations? And this is, I think, an added dimension to deep sea mining in the Norwegian context, which makes it potentially more relevant for the rest of the world, where we still wonder about the relationship between resource endowments and societal development, and whether this current model of economic growth can be sustained into the future, both politically, but also in terms of the environmental cost it entails.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything else that you want to cover? Any other topics that we missed? Or
well, we haven't said much about the historical development of deep sea mining as an industry as such, but which is really what I know a lot better.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of my conversation with Mats Ingulstad. Tune in next week for the second half of this conversation, where Mats gets more specifically into the history of deep sea mining. As usual, if you find this podcast worth sharing, then please share it. You can also give it a review on whatever platform you're listening to. Thanks, and see you next week.
I throw my arms up